The next legal act on our timeline is the Wartime Elections Act and Military Voters Act. World War I was a major influencer of voting rights in Canada as it led to the introduction of this act. The Wartime Elections Act and Military Voters Act was introduced as a method to influence the federal referendum on the subject of conscription. The Canadian government at the time supported conscription but needed the support of the Canadian public to carry out this action, and so this act was passed as a method of providing females related to soldiers and other supporters of conscription the right to vote so that conscription could be implemented with the quote-unquote support from the public. There were some positive and some negative impacts of this act. This act was withdrawn. However, the trust it had created between the Canadian government, public, and women led to both black and white women acquiring their right to vote as long as they met the same conditions that were required of men. Indigenous women were still excluded from the new right women had gained, as they still had to give up their status in order to vote. This act also took away voting rights from Germans, Austro-Hungarians, and anyone who was an immigrant or citizen from an enemy country during World War I. By granting women their right to vote, changes could be seen occurring in Canada's voting rights, which previously only considered men worthy of voting. However, much change was still required. The Dominion Election Act of 1920 was passed 2 years after women gained their right to vote. After the passing of the Wartime Elections Act and Military Voters Act during World War I, many Canadian citizens were deprived of their rights, and this act was an effort to create voting, as well as political equality in Canada. As a result of this, Canadian women were enabled to run as political candidates, which was another milestone in women's suffrage. The voting rights that had been terminated due to World War I were also restored. Chinese and Indian immigrants and citizens were also granted the right to vote in federal elections through this act, assuming they were given the right to vote by the provincial government of their provinces. Amendments made to the Dominion Elections Act in 1948 eliminated race as a basis of prohibiting voting, thus granting all Asian Canadians the right to vote. Despite this act, Indigenous persons were still required to give up their Indian status in order to vote. The last and most important legal act that was used by the Canadian government was the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. This legal act was drafted and passed as a method of creating complete equality between all Canadian citizens, regardless of their gender, ethnicity, or race. The biggest and first most change made by this act was that it provided Indigenous citizens the right to vote. While this charter was being drafted, the Canadian government realized that it would be very contradictory to create a charter based on equality, but continue to force Indigenous citizens to give up their Indian status. Because of this, all Indigenous citizens were given the right to vote federally, without having to sacrifice anything or follow specific conditions. Although many more smaller legal acts were part of Canada's voting history, these major legal acts were the biggest milestones in the process, and they are the reason voting rights are so equal in Canada today.
Created using Powtoon.